All right, everybody, welcome to the program. This is the Otherppl Show, a weekly podcast featuring in-depth conversations with today's leading writers. It's a books and culture show. I'm Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. I appreciate you listening. Thank you for being here. I hope you're doing okay out there, wherever you happen to be. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button wherever you listen, and you can follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky. I've got a great episode for you today. I'm going to be in conversation momentarily with Francesca Wade, author of a new biography of Gertrude Stein entitled Gertrude Stein, An Afterlife. It is available from Scribner. This is a wonderful book. It is innovatively structured and deeply researched. It is a biography of one of the 20th century's most influential and mythologized artists. This is also a book that sheds new light on the life of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, her partner. It helps to draw into focus the particulars of their relationship and the key roles that Alice Toklas played in helping to both foster Gertrude Stein's creative life and also to shape and perpetuate her legacy. A very fascinating conversation with Francesca Wade about the lives of Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas. That is coming up in just a couple of minutes. So I haven't really been doing monologues on this show for quite a while, where I sort of riff at the beginning and talk about what's going on in my life or what's going on in my head. I've sort of been wondering if maybe I'll start doing a little bit more of that as I approach the 1000th author interview in the history of this program. That is coming up next. This episode is the 999th author interview that I have conducted, and 1000 will air, I believe, on Tuesday. So that's kind of crazy. I don't want to make too much of it, but I think when you make 1,000 of anything, it's worth at least, taking a moment to ask yourself, like, what have I done with my life? I feel some degree of pride. I mean, it's a body of work. I've really loved having these conversations. I'll talk more about this, I guess, when the actual 1000th episode airs, but I don't know I guess if I were really on top of my game, I would be doing more to sort of mark this moment, use it as like a marketing ploy. I don't know. Nobody cares. I mean, nobody cares nearly as much as I do, but 1000 author interviews over the past 15 years. The show is now in its 15th year, officially. I think the birthday of the show is September 14th, which I also, I guess, should do a better job of celebrating. But, it just passed right on by. I didn't even realize it. I've just been very busy, running Deep Dive, my new company, and putting out 3 episodes a week. I'm also thinking of trying to kind of give the Otherppl Patreon a makeover. There are some people who support this show via Patreon. I love every single one of them passionately. But, if I'm going to make it to 2,000 episodes, there's going to need to be a lot more people who are supporting this show. Advertising does some good work, but it's a lot. A lot goes into putting 3 episodes out every week and putting 2 literary interviews together every week. And it's got to be remunerative. So I think what I might do is create a situation where new episodes of the show are available ad-free on Patreon. I'm wondering if people would support the show, on a monthly basis at some sort of manageable cost in order to get access to ad-free episodes. I also want to say, too, I have received multiple complaints from listeners letting me know that there have been advertisements for like ice on my show in the programmatic ads. I am so sorry. And I want you to know that I have nothing to do with these programmatic ads. Like, I don't choose which ads run on my show. You know how this works. This is just, there's an advertising company with which I work, and these programmatic ads get fed to them and they just kind of show up in the feed. That said, I have filed a complaint. The ad company that I work with has let me know that many people have filed similar complaints, and they are working on getting these ads blocked. But I guess what ICE does is that they keep shifting how they categorize their ads to make it hard for the ads to get blocked. So, they'll categorize as a government ad one time, and then the next time it'll be a jobs ad. It's tricky and nefarious and annoying. And I have no interest in advertising for the government in any capacity. So my apologies there. But yeah, I was thinking that it would be ad-free on Patreon for Patreon supporters. And then I would also create like content incentives where Patreon subscribers might have exclusive access to particular kinds of episodes. So that is in my brain, and it, I think, is going to be in the works. It's going to take some muscle. I've got to put it all together and find the time to do that. But I might, as we head into the second 1,000 episodes of this program, try to make a shift that will help the show survive. And I appreciate everybody listening. Obviously, it's not a show without you. So otherwise, I don't even know what to tell you. It's all work all the time. There's not much going on in my life other than work. I guess that's what middle age is about. Nothing but work. All work and no play. It's all right. I love doing what I do. It could be worse, but I haven't seen any movies. The last movie I saw was One Battle After Another. I've talked about that on the Brad and Mira show. And every book that I read for this show. So you know what I'm reading. I don't think you want to hear what I'm eating. That's not interesting. I eat, I read, I work, I sleep, I walk my dog, Twiggy, which you can see on a daily basis on my Instagram stories. I try to post a video on Instagram stories every day of Twiggy and I going for a walk in the Hollywood Hills. That's my life. It's very routine. It's very routinized. Maybe to a degree that exceeds most people, but I feel like that's just how it's got to be. If you're going to get stuff done, you've got to get into a routine. And then you're like, well, am I living my life? Am I just a boring person who's just going through the motions? Have I turned myself into some kind of machine? I don't think I have. I don't hate my routine. I just feel like it's a necessity. I also think a little discipline equals freedom. You get your stuff done. You make lists. It can sound good to just live really spontaneously and chaotically. But that's its own kind of exhaustion. It's maybe less exhausting to have a routine. That's what I tell myself anyway. See, this is why I don't do monologues anymore, because then I just start talking about the minutia of my existence, which is not that entertaining. But maybe I'll do it, just to try to heighten the parasocial relationship fostered by this show. You'll feel like you know me better. And maybe what I'm talking about speaks to you. Maybe you're in the middle of your routine right now. You're on the treadmill, listening to a podcast, running 7-minute mile after 7-minute mile, trying to burn off stress, lose weight, stay fit into middle age. So anyway, today's episode is brought to you by Echo Books, publisher of A Different Kind of Tension, New and Selected Stories by Jonathan Lethem. This is the official October pick of the Otherppl Book Club. That is my book club. I encourage you to sign up for the book club. Not only is it a great way to support this program and the work that I do, you also get a book delivered to your door every 30 days for less than the cost of a book. I can't make a better deal. I can't create one. A new book delivered to your door every 30 days. I interview book club authors on this program, so you can listen and then read, or read and then listen. It's up to you. And it just, it enriches your life. So check it out. You can sign up for the book club over at otherppl.com. One more time, the new book by Jonathan Lethem is called A Different Kind of Tension, New and Selected Stories, available from Echo Books. So a quick reminder that I do a weekly email newsletter. Got to give it a plug. Sign up for the newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. I will let you know about the latest episodes of this show on a weekly basis. And I also share a list of links to things that I've been reading and finding interesting. So if you want to know what I've been reading and what I've been finding interesting, this is the way to do that. Go sign up at bradlisti.substack.com. Also got to give a quick plug to Deep Dive, my new company. Deep Dive is a new learning platform that offers in-depth courses for curious minds. The initial courses available from Deep Dive are writing-related courses. The flagship course is called How to Write a Novel. It is more than 50 hours in length. It features more than 50 hours of insight and instruction from nearly 24 celebrated contemporary authors, including people like Emily St. John Mandel, Stephen Graham Jones, Melissa Broder, Steve Almond, Vivi Ganeshananthan, and many more. There's never been a writing course quite like this one. It's hard to write a novel, and this course, How to Write a Novel from Deep Dive, will accompany you through the writing of a draft. It's a course that is commensurate with the scale of the task at hand. The way that I designed it, I sort of had this idea in mind that it could accompany you as you complete a draft over, say, the course of a calendar year. It's that big. And there's like 30 hours of bonus content drawn from the archives of the Otherppl show included in the course. So all told, it's probably more than 80 hours in length. It's a lot of content. It's a lot of instruction. It's a lot of gold. And it's like getting an MFA without having to pay MFA prices. It's available for a fraction of the price of an MFA. You got to check it out. You can do so over at www.deepdive.audio. I should note, too, that there is another course available from Deep Dive at present. It is called How to Write Autobiographical Fiction. It is taught by Hannah Pittard, author of several novels, including most recently, If You Love It, Let It Kill You. And that course also features Michael Wheaton, the founder of Autofocus Books. So that is an intensive. It is shorter form, and it is available now at deepdive.audio. And then there are other courses in the works, and those will be available soon. I'm not going to tell you what they are just yet, but they are imminent. I am hard at work on those, and I'm going to keep the courses coming. I'm going to build out the writing vertical, I think, first, and then eventually, God willing, over time, Deep Dive will expand into other areas of interest. So you can find out more at www.deepdive.audio, and you can follow Deep Dive on Instagram and Blue Sky. Okay, so my guest, once again, is Francesca Wade. Her new book is called Gertrude Stein, An Afterlife. It is available from Scribner. Francesca is also the author of Square Haunting, 5 Writers in London Between the Wars. Her writing has appeared in the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, the Paris Review, Granta, and other publications. It was an absolute delight meeting her and talking with her about the lives of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. It feels like a necessary episode. I think this is the first Gertrude Stein episode in the history of this show, so I'm very pleased to add it to the archives, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Here I am with Francesca Wade, and her book, one more time, is called Gertrude Stein, An Afterlife.
I guess I don't really remember when I first heard of Gertrude Stein. I feel she's a famous name that has in a way always been part of the consciousness. But I guess what her name associated or brought up was probably, broad sort of general ideas of, Bohemian 20s Paris, Hemingway and Fitzgerald and the Lost Generation. And so it wasn't until I picked up Janet Malcolm's book, Two Lives, about Stein and Toklas, that I really started to learn about her and want to know more. And I don't remember quite why I picked that book up, except that I am very interested in Janet Malcolm. I loved her book, The Silent Woman, which is a interrogation of biography and the kind of, different stakes that different players had in the kind of Sylvia Plath legend. And it was reading her book, Two Lives. She tells the story of the scholar Leon Katz, who'd spent months interviewing Alice B. Toklas after Stein's death in Paris, and then had not shown anyone the transcripts of those interviews. And I wasn't at that point thinking I would write a book about Stein, but I was just intrigued by this idea of kind of unseen interviews by Toklas from the period when she was acting as the kind of custodian of Stein's legacy. And it turned out that these papers had gone to the Beinecke Library at Yale, where Stein's archive is, and no one seemed yet to have looked at them. So that is where the project began. And at that point, I thought it would be a kind of investigation into biography, slightly in the vein of The Silent Woman, kind of exploring Toklas's role as a sort of gatekeeper to the early biographers. But it expanded so far from there because Stein is just such a fascinating figure that I wanted to know everything about her.
And Leon Katz, can you talk just a little bit more about who he was and what his role was when it comes to not only your book, but like the legacy of Gertrude Stein and his relationship with Alice B. Toklas, because he's kind of an interesting figure in his own right.
Yeah, totally interesting. He was a graduate student at Columbia in the early 50s or late 40s, and turned up at Yale, which had recently opened up its Gertrude Stein archive because Stein had sent her papers there over the 1930s, the kind of last decade of her life, with the idea that she wanted her work to have a legacy and to have a chance of being kind of memorialized, and that future researchers would have access to material to write about her in the future. And he was interested in Stein's early writing. He was planning a dissertation on her novel, The Making of Americans, which had taken Stein a decade to write, and which is, I think, one of her greatest, but also probably one of her least kind of read and understood works. It's a 1,000-page epic investigation into the kind of nature of human character, written in it's the moment in which she sort of discovered her voice, really, her kind of very incantatory, repetitious style, kind of building up a sense of people's kind of inner essence through observation of their characters, and an effort to sort of stratify the entirety of humanity into kind of character types to see how people relate to each other and themselves. And Katz wanted to kind of write about the origins of this novel and how Stein had kind of come to write it in her first years in Paris. And he was looking through boxes at Yale of what he expected to be kind of drafts of the novel, but he found a whole lot of notebooks, which looked like they were almost diaries from those years, full of kind of diagrams, character sketches, notes on people in Stein's life, and lots of names he recognized, but also lots of names he didn't recognize. And he instantly saw that what he had was kind of a key to kind of excavating the story behind this mysterious novel. He could see early versions of it in which he could really trace her route from a kind of first draft, which was going to be really a kind of straightforward realist family epic, drawing very much on her own sort of German Jewish family's immigration to America following 3 generations of the family. And some of that material went into the finished version, but Katz was able to trace the way it had evolved kind of out of this kind of 19th century style and into something totally new and original as Stein's kind of distinctive vision came to the fore. And through looking at these notebooks, he could trace what Stein was thinking and, who she was talking to, what she was interested in over the course of writing the book. And he could trace her burgeoning relationships with artists who she'd met in Paris, Picasso in particular, who'd become a close friend, and she analyzes Picasso and his work a lot in the notebooks. But also he could trace the start of her relationship with Alice B. Toklas, which he came to see as totally central to Stein kind of gaining the confidence to write a novel sort of totally unlike anything that had been written before. And I think because he had access to these notebooks, which even Toklas hadn't seen, she was willing to talk to him as she had not really been willing to talk to biographers before. Toklas was really quite a private person and wanted scholars to write about Stein's work, but not about her personal life. But I think because Katz had this material that really showed how deeply her work came out of her personal life, it was sort of intriguing for Toklas to kind of revisit parts of her past that she hadn't thought about for a long time.
So she sat down for extensive interviews with Katz. He amassed all of this material in notebooks and then was going to write something. Yes. That never came to fruition. And then it ended up in this archive. I'm curious, how you got to it, and you got to it first.
Yeah. So Katz, left Paris after spending months interviewing Toklas. And then he really spent the next 50 years, the rest of his life, working on a book that was going to draw on their interviews and kind of, put the making of Americans into new context through his conversations with Toklas. But it never materialized. He missed deadlines with publishers, and over the years, Stein scholars, kept wondering, what was this material that Katz was kind of sitting on? And this is where Janet Malcolm kind of picked up the story and talked to scholars who kind of expressed their frustration that Katz's book was taking so long. They felt that Stein studies as a field had kind of ground to a halt because it needed a kind of injection of new material to, get the making of Americans taken seriously, potentially put on college syllabuses, when meanwhile it kind of continued to languish pretty much in obscurity. And Malcolm tried to get in touch with Katz, and they didn't cross paths. They sort of tried to meet at an airport, and Malcolm sort of insinuates that he turned up on the wrong day, perhaps because he didn't really want to see her. There's a letter in the archive from Katz to Malcolm pointing out it was her fault that they didn't cross paths, which is quite...
Well, why the reticence? I don't understand. Why would he be so reluctant to talk to Malcolm?
Well, I mean, I think I can understand from his perspective. If Janet Malcolm comes calling, wanting access to your life's work for her own sort of scoop, you wouldn't necessarily want to share it. I think his attitude was simply he wasn't being secretive about his material. He was working on his book, and he didn't want to release it until he felt it was ready. And I think he also felt that Malcolm was after a story that wasn't the story he wanted his material to tell. Malcolm was not particularly interested in Stein as a writer, and I think Katz probably sensed that. And
wait, what was she interested in her as?
I think in relation to Katz, she was interested in this kind of, as in her Sylvia Plath book, I guess, in the sort of tensions between scholars when different sort of narratives compete with each other, or in the kind of the fraughtness of the situation in which someone is working on a book but can never finish it. I think he probably sensed she was interested in his kind of psychology rather than in the work that he was engaged in. And I think the reason it was taking so long was that not only that he was very busy with other things. I mean, he was a teacher, he was a dramaturg. He wrote plays. But also I think that it was an enormous task, and The Making of Americans is a huge novel, incredibly complex. And I mean, having now been to his archive, it's full of references he was making to looking up every possible kind of reference in the novel, really untangling what Stein was doing, working out the structural scheme, seeing how different parts of the book relate to each other. He'd done lots of interviews with people who'd known Stein. I think it was just a kind of a huge project to kind of assimilate. And I think he just, didn't want to be written about until he felt his work was done to his own satisfaction.
For 50 years?
For 50 years.
That might be a record. And then he died and he never published it.
He died in 2017, having pretty much just kind of completed the book to his satisfaction. And I read Malcolm's book a couple of years after that, and just kind of, Google search to find out, what had happened since her book, which was, I think it was 2 New Yorker articles in about 2003 and 2005, and the book was published in 2007. So I wondered if he'd responded to the book or if he'd published these interviews since, and could see online that his papers had recently gone to the Beinecke Library at Yale. So I got in touch with them just to see if I could go and see them. And the papers hadn't yet been catalogued, but they let me look at them. And eventually, amidst all of the other materials, there was this notebook which he had written in during those sessions with Toklas, with, the very material that Janet Malcolm was, at least in theory, after.
So wait, and then the book itself that he wrote, just to be clear, like that's in the papers too? Has it ever been published?
Yes. His sons, a couple of years ago, I think 2021, kind of published his life's work themselves. So it is available. I think you can just buy it on Amazon, and it's an enormous book. It's the contents of Stein's notebooks, the notebooks that he had found at the archive in the 1950s, interspersed with his commentary and Alice B. Toklas's commentary, with a long kind of introduction by him. So it's a amazing resource, but not entirely useful in its current form, without an index and a sort of full kind of scholarly apparatus. So I do hope that that something else will happen with it at some point, because it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and this book of yours is titled Gertrude Stein and Afterlife. I'm interested in that subtitle. I think you've alluded a little bit to it, but I want to hear you talk about why you picked an afterlife as the subtitle.
I guess it kind of came about, from kind of riffing on the usual subtitle for a biography is a life, or, the life, if you want to be more arrogant about it. And I liked an afterlife because originally this book was going to start at Stein's death, and in a way she wasn't even going to kind of appear kind of on stage. I wanted to write about the 20 years after her death, during which Alice Toklas kind of stewarded her estate and carried out Stein's kind of last wishes, which were for a publication program that would bring everything she'd ever written back into print, and for people to be using the archive that she had amassed. And I was so interested in Stein as someone who self-mythologized, like no one else, but who also felt that she didn't get the acclaim that she deserved in her lifetime, and felt convinced that readers would come to her work eventually, as long as that work was available to them. And I think Stein thought a lot about her posthumous existence. And in her will, she left money and instructions for this enormous program to bring into print everything that, all of the manuscripts that had languished in cupboards and filing cabinets, and that were now among her papers at Yale. And I wanted to explore also the work of those early biographers who came to the archive and very quickly started to discover things which kind of challenged or contradicted or, deepened the portrait of Stein that she had put out for herself in her autobiographies, and to explore, I guess, for Toklas, the partner who was, left alone, to have her own kind of memories and narratives challenged the narratives that had sort of solidified between them over the years through their very kind of public, quite performative relationship. So really the book began as a kind of study of biography, of the way that, a biography can only be composed from the materials that a subject makes available, and what happens when the kind of memories and desires of sort of living people with a stake in the past are sort of set into contrast with sort of documentary material found in archives. But it expanded beyond that, and I decided actually to include the first half to really tell the story of Stein's life in order to kind of set the afterlife sort of in counterpoint, because we need to know, about her desire for this afterlife and what it meant for her, this idea of kind of posthumous fame.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that this book is structured in two main parts. The first part is Gertrude Stein's life, beginning to end, essentially. And then the second part of the book is the 20 years or so after she died, in which Alice Toklas functioned as her steward, steward of her legacy. And that's really interesting. And then there's also a section at the very end where you talk about the influences that she had.
Yeah.
And, that's fascinating. I didn't realize, I hadn't really put my head to it, but when you look around, there are some real legacy influences that she had in other art forms, and typically in the avant-garde space in those art forms. I'm thinking of John Cage as a musician who was very heavily influenced by her.
Definitely, yeah. That was one of the parts of the book I kind of enjoyed researching the most, because, in her lifetime, much of Stein's work wasn't published, and the work that was published tended to have pretty small readerships and to be generally kind of mocked resoundingly by critics. And yet Stein always had devoted admirers too. And I think she really held on to the idea that her work would find its readers, and that there were people out there who would see what she was doing and see its importance. In 1926, she gave a lecture, which was really the first time she had started to kind of explain her work or offer anything close to a kind of artistic manifesto. I think she got this invitation at a somewhat low ebb, when she was receiving rejections all over the place and terrible reviews, while her peers like James Joyce were being held up as pioneers of new forms. And at this point, Stein made this point, which kind of carried me through the book, where she says the creator of truly radical new work will always be an outlaw until they become a classic. And I think she at that point was feeling very much an outlaw, but she said, contemporary tastes always lag behind, true innovation. And in 50 years' time, my work will come to be understood. And I think she really had to trust and hope that this readership would come, perhaps not even in her lifetime. And I guess, one thing I loved kind of tracing was the ways in which that statement has almost become a prophecy, that Stein's work has taken on its own life, particularly, I guess, in the kind of downtown New York world of the 50s and 60s, where people were experimenting with all kinds of different forms and disciplines. And she was really important to John Cage, to the Fluxus movement and happenings, and the scene around the Judson Dance Theatre, and then somewhat later the language poets really took up Stein. And I just think, that in a way she was right. Her work did find and has found and always will find its readers, just as it will always have its detractors. And it's hard to think of anyone with a more polarizing body of work really than Gertrude Stein. And this has always been the case. I found it amazing to read, even very early reviews of her work. And her books did get a lot of reviews. I mean, there were, almost more reviews and parodies and comment pieces on Tender Buttons, published in 1914, than there were copies printed of it. Most people who wrote about it hadn't read it. But Stein came to stand for something that Americans in particular were quite fascinated by, which is this, eccentric European, new sort of Cubist literature coming out of Paris. And there was this kind of fascination that, this work doesn't make sense. It's nonsense. It's bizarre. It's audacious. How can she possibly write like this? And then usually these pieces would say, but some say she's a genius. And, we therefore, we're all talking about it. We have to admit that we're interested.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm curious to know about your own personal stake in this. Like, did you, in reacting to the ways in which her reputation fluctuated over the decades, feel like you wanted to reframe her or maybe recover the more positive aspects of her legacy? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, what's your position on her?
Well, I guess I didn't start the book with a particular agenda or a direction, really, but actually she drew me in, and this immersion over years in her work has been an incredibly kind of rewarding experience. And in a way, she's taught me how to read her, and I've learned how to read her from reading other people on her. I mean, Stein, the body of sort of Stein criticism that is out there is just amazing, because her work is so kind of rich for close readings and, kind of ingenious interpretations, and so much interesting work done on her kind of process. And I just feel reading Stein requires a totally new way of reading, because her work, she was trying to do something that had never really been done before with words. I mean, she wanted words in her writing not to be used in literary ways, or in ways that we use them when talking, to convey meaning, whereby each word, brings up in the reader or listener a memory of every other time you've heard that word used, and, sentences which go from A to B and, follow rules of grammar such that words are kind of placed in their right places. She wanted to see what would happen if you treated words, as things in themselves, and tried to strip them of their conventional meanings and associations and the sort of burden of bearing meaning, and treated them, and let them loose, putting them together, through the way they sounded together, or the way they looked on the page, or through sort of intuitive associations that came to mind, almost like a Cubist painting that is trying to capture an essence of something without necessarily capturing a likeness. And I find I've become totally kind of intrigued and beguiled by Stein's project and the different phases of her writing. And I guess just wanted to do her justice, really, or to take her seriously, because Stein insisted her work was something she took incredibly seriously. She got very frustrated at criticism, which suggested, for example, that she was doing some sort of automatic writing, which was a kind of allegation that came up often. But yeah, for her, actually, words were extremely precise, and writing was not something that she could just kind of dash off. It required a total concentration. And I feel that often her work is almost sidelined in conversations about her. Her life and her legend and her personality have always been so kind of compelling that somehow often her work is seen as this sort of eccentric addition to what's really her cultural status. So I wanted to kind of make the case for that writing and show just how central her writing was to her daily life, and how important it's been for many others.
Yeah, I think, like, as I was reading this book, I was thinking about Gertrude Stein and this influence that she has had, and the afterlife she has experienced, and the afterlife that her work has experienced. And am reminded of a quote, and I'm going to botch it, but it's about the band Velvet Underground, and I'm forgetting who even said it, but it was like Velvet Underground only had 1,000 fans, but every single one of them started a band.
Yeah, I think that's the quote. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like that's kind of how I see her. I don't think she's ever going to have some mass readership, though who knows, maybe in the future. But I think maybe, and I think too, maybe in my research or in my preparation, I read something that you said where you consider her more like a philosopher of language than a conventional author.
Yeah, I think that's quite a helpful way to think about her, because I think, and I guess that's what I mean when I say she sort of requires a whole new way of reading, that, if you pick up a Gertrude Stein book and you're expecting, a linear narrative with characters and a plot, and sentences that make sense, you're not going to get it, and you'll be disappointed if those are the terms, by which you judge her. So in a way, I think that's why it's helpful to have some context for her project and for what she's doing, in order to sort of be open to what her writing, might actually make you feel or think. In a way, I think her work really, it sort of requires a kind of curiosity and an openness, and perhaps just a trust and a sort of, maybe a kind of a loosening of expectations, that actually it's best to read Stein, not worrying, wait, I don't understand, I don't see what she's talking about here, because actually, she always said, it's not, the work means whatever you want it to mean. It's not about meaning. It's actually about getting away from meaning and thinking instead, I guess, about perception, about the way that the brain processes language. She studied psychology at Harvard, at the Radcliffe, the women's equivalent of Harvard, and had gone on to study the brainstem at Johns Hopkins. She was very much steeped in a kind of scientific background, and knew a lot about the workings of sort of neurology. And I think that background, combined with her immersion in modern art in Paris, created this kind of openness to thinking about the ways in which, we process the external world, and, what it means to apprehend, another person or an object, and, how to capture a kind of fleeting experience of looking at something or of being in the present without trying to describe something or narrate events. She was trying to do something deeper, I guess, and that's why the writing it's difficult, or it's a totally different experience to reading a story. So,
well, yeah, and I think like you said it well. I think her like social and cultural context, the times in which she was living, the place that she was living, the group that she was running with, which included Picasso, like at the advent of Cubism, like all of that stuff factors into her work and how it evolved. I also couldn't help but wonder, because she was a pretty uncommon figure. She would be uncommon even today. Like this charisma, this, she didn't have much self-doubt, or if she did, she hid it very well.
Yeah.
And she was a lesbian without apology.
Yeah.
And maintained this relationship with Alice Toklas that everybody in Paris understood was a coupling, a romantic coupling, in a time when the acceptance of homosexual relationships was far lesser than it is today. And I couldn't help but wonder if that fact might have driven her into a more avant-garde realm as a writer. Because to write about her life and her psychology and her desires and experiences in a more realist form would have been entirely untenable. Or maybe she just feared the exposure and what it might cause for her. Did you ever have that thought?
Yeah. She, in fact, the very first novel she ever wrote was an autobiographical novel kind of inspired by Henry James in style, called QED, which she wrote in 1903, and the couple of months when she just arrived in Paris. And she was kind of escaping America and escaping a love triangle that she'd been in involving two other women, others who from Baltimore, which had sort of gone wrong. And she wrote this novel, and then she put it away in a drawer. And the story of this novel actually is quite a significant part of the book, because it was never published in her lifetime. And after she died, the archivist at Yale wondered what had happened to this manuscript, because in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, Stein's best-selling memoir of 1932, she mentions writing a short novel on arriving in France, and she mentions that she'd never published it. And the archivist wrote to Alice Toklas to ask, what had happened to this manuscript. And this, I think, was the first moment of real dilemma for Toklas, because it was actually Alice Toklas who didn't want Stein to publish that novel when Stein came across the manuscript again in 1932 and showed it to her. And I think that was partly because Toklas was hurt by this depiction of Stein's passion for another woman, even though it was long before they had met. But I think Stein perhaps hadn't told her about the significance of this other woman, May Bookstaver. But also Toklas was very private about their relationship, and it's quite hard. It's quite sort of, I think people found it slightly odd or slightly hard to understand, because in a way their relationship had been so public. Stein had literally written Toklas's autobiography in her own voice, in which Toklas spends all her time talking about how wonderful Gertrude Stein is. And they went everywhere together. They lived together. They'd come to America for a 7-month lecture tour, and were together everywhere they went. And yet somehow no one had quite, sort of outed them, as it were. I think in a way their relationship was taken for granted. And, whenever Toklas was mentioned, she was described as, Stein's secretary or her companion, or, some sort of euphemism. But yeah, of course, their friends, understood. And in fact,
wait. I mean, Gertrude Stein is like super butch.
Yeah.
And then Alice B. Toklas has got a mustache and has like a masculine presentation combined with the feminine. It's very blurry. And so there's something sort of awesome and even a little bit comical to me to imagine these two like wandering around Paris or, on this 7-month tour through the States, and anybody having any doubt what was going on or not getting it.
Yeah. I think it was probably just, so they were probably so estranged to comprehend that no one even started to question it. It was they were just, here they are.
It's like, but that's the thing, is the fact that they were comfortable and just sort of unabashed.
Yeah.
That both of them, I think, and it was not probably common in that time to be that way. And I think maybe part of the afterlife of Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas is that they were a lesbian couple that presented themselves to the world without apology or explanation.
Yeah. But I guess, just to finish the story, Toklas didn't want this novel published, or she was very worried that it would cause a scandal, or that people would talk about it as a lesbian novel, and that would somehow taint Stein's reputation. And I think the archivist was rather nonplussed by this, because he thought, isn't it obvious that, that it wouldn't be a scandal? But Toklas really was very worried on that point. But eventually she did allow the novel to be published. In a way, she put her duty to Stein's manuscripts before her own sort of deep-seated desires for privacy. And Edmund Wilson reviewed it in the New Yorker. He'd written about Stein kind of several times over her career, and he reviewed this, her very first book published posthumously. And he made that point that you made earlier, where he said, I now see that, here is a lesbian, love story told in, pretty straightforward terms, which Stein didn't feel she could publish. And he said, I now wonder if the kind of opacity of her later writing was due to, to sort of, having an aspect of her identity that she felt she couldn't be be fully open about, that she, sort of occluded. And I don't know that I buy that, because actually Stein was incredibly open in her writing about the eroticism of life with Toklas. And actually, I think the fact was that people didn't either ignored it or didn't really read her work closely enough to see how often she talks about her wife, how often she uses, very kind of sexual language and descriptions. And it's totally clear, or at least it seems from this vantage point, she's writing love poems, she's writing about sex, to even Tender Buttons is really a very kind of erotic work, situated in a sort of domestic space. And yet, critics tended to kind of politely or, pass over it. And so it wasn't really until more of her work was published later, and then decades later was kind of republished in new contexts by lesbian presses or feminist presses, that she really began to be kind of celebrated as a lesbian icon, which was very kind of important for how she's read now. And and lesbian queer theory and feminist studies have opened up loads of interesting new ways of reading and rereading Stein's work that critics at the time didn't really engage with.
Well, let's talk in depth about this relationship between Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas, which is, it's central to the story of their lives, obviously, but it's very much central to your book. And I think Alice Toklas gets a careful examination in the back half of your book that maybe she has not always gotten in the story of Gertrude Stein. They were very inextricable, and I feel like Alice Toklas played a very key role in the creative life of Gertrude Stein. But let's just go back to the beginning. Like, what was the meet cute? How did they start dating? Like, just take us back to the beginning of this relationship.
Yeah, well, they both grew up in California, and they both came to Paris. Gertrude Stein had gone in 1903 with her brother Leo, and they'd set up home. They had a kind of small inheritance which they used to start buying art, really just for fun and to decorate their apartment. And this, soon kind of blossomed into this incredible collection of modern art, which soon people were coming and flocking to their apartment to see, because it was really the only place you could see works by Picasso and Matisse and so on. And Gertrude Stein's other brother, Michael, and his wife, Sarah, joined them in Paris. And in fact, they really kept on collecting Matisse. Gertrude kind of got fed up with Matisse and was really more of a Picasso person. But Sarah particularly loved Matisse. And in about 1906, just after the San Francisco earthquake, Sarah and Michael went back to America to kind of check on stuff there. And Sarah took with her 2 Matisse paintings, which were the first of his paintings to cross the ocean. And she wanted to show them to some of her old friends in San Francisco, which included Alice Toklas. And Toklas, at this point, her mother had died, and she was kind of keeping house for her father and her uncles and her grandfather, and was, really kind of chafing to escape, I think. And Sarah invited her to just come back with them to Paris. And she hesitated at first, but eventually she went with a friend, and I think didn't intend to stay forever. But she arrived, Sarah introduced her to her sister-in-law, Gertrude, and in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, Stein writes as Toklas that at that moment, a bell within her rang that proved she was in the presence of a genius. And I think the relationship took a little time to kind of blossom. And in fact, one thing that Leon Katz found in the notebooks that, Stein's private notebooks from that period was some pretty vitriolic character sketches of Toklas from their first meetings. Stein at this point was fascinated by people. She was trying to work on this enormous character study and to come up with this kind of idea that if you looked at people closely enough over an extended period of time, listened to them talk at length, observed their mannerisms and the ways in which they sort of repeat themselves, then you could come to a kind of understanding of what she called people's bottom nature, which is their sort of, their true kind of, inner essence. And she sort of believed that everyone could be kind of stratified according to certain kind of personality types, which she was charting in her own notebooks in this scheme, which was kind of expanding and expanding. And this is really what this research pours into The Making of Americans, which is in a way the history of its narrator's attempts to write the novel and create the character scheme that we're reading. So Toklas was a early kind of character study for Stein, unbeknownst to her. And it's amazing in the notebooks to really see how Stein's, very sort of cold, analytical approach to the people she was observing kind of softened with Toklas as they became closer. Stein at this point was living with her older brother Leo, and Leo was not impressed by Stein's writing. He thought The Making of Americans was a ridiculous project. And it was Toklas, I think, who gave her the belief and the confidence that what she was doing was important, and who made it clear that she was ready to devote her own life to creating the conditions to let Stein devote her life to art. And the two of them moved in together. Well, Toklas moved in with Stein and Leo rather soon moved out. And from this point, their relationship, their life was about Stein and about her work. And it's such a incredibly fascinating and such a complex relationship, and quite difficult to really feel, understand them, because I think their public presentation of themselves was very different to the way they were in private. And I think, from quite early on, they were performing this role as a couple, the genius and the subservient wife, whose existence is all about upholding the sort of mythology of the genius. And I think friends often found this, bizarre, and couldn't quite believe that Toklas was really as devoted to Stein as she seemed. Hemingway in A Movable Feast makes these, insinuations that, there's a kind of sadomasochistic element to the relationship, and Toklas was really in control. And, they were sort of enigmatic to people who watched them. And what I really found from hearing Toklas's voice later, and from seeing their sort of the traces of their life, of their private world in the archive, was really how collaborative their relationship was. And, how in a way what they presented outwardly was a sort of mutual shared kind of performance, of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, and, who they really were, was perhaps quite different to that.
I got to be honest, I find both of them on some level terrifying. And
yeah, you wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable going around for tea.
Well, I mean, there's just this kind of, anybody who's that confident in their own mind and beliefs freaks me out a little bit.
Yeah.
There's not like an ounce of humility in Gertrude Stein. She considered herself a genius.
Yeah.
And she was so determined to be famous.
Yeah.
And wanted that adulation and wanted everybody to recognize her greatness.
Yeah.
And then Alice B. Toklas, as the kind of gatekeeper to her life, was incredibly jealous and protective and kind of vicious in blocking access to Gertrude and excommunicating people, Hemingway being maybe like most famous among them. It was not Gertrude Stein who disliked Hemingway, though I guess she maybe came to dislike him. It was Alice Toklas who, I think, put the kibosh on that relationship.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Because Gertrude it was always like Alice was running interference, making sure Gertrude wouldn't talk to the wives.
Yes.
And right? I mean, it's a fascinating dynamic.
So bizarre.
And I can't get over, I just can't get over people who are like that, who are just like, I think what it makes me fearful of is that in order to make it as an artist, you have to be insane, like egomaniacal and megalomaniacal. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as somebody who's like been immersed in these lives for many years. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, I guess in a way, for Stein, the thing is, no one else was saying she was a genius. There's this amazing moment in The Making of Americans where she writes about the kind of despondency of trying to make work that you think is incredibly important and that you feel you have a vision that you're striving towards and, within reach of, but everyone around you thinks you're insane. And then she says, and I think, at that point, she's really thinking of her brother and other friends who she'd shown this work to, who just thought, they didn't get it. And then she says that, what is amazing is when someone says yes to it and suddenly everything becomes possible. And I think, that was for her meeting Toklas, who just came in with a kind of resounding yes to what she was doing. And said, I believe this is important too. And, we're going to make this happen. And I think Stein, bolstered by Toklas's belief, her own self-belief had to drive her through, because she saw her peers, be recognized and praised and praise each other and publish each other often. And she saw her own work be mocked and reviled. I mean, some of the kind of tone of a lot of the criticism of Stein is it's incredibly hostile and always has been. I mean, there's Wyndham Lewis launched some absolute tirades against her in the 20s, which are full of homophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny. I mean, there's always the backdrop to it all is always a sense of, this person is, is bizarre and beyond the pale and, is taking up too much space. And I think Stein's, in a way, quite performative self-belief and, her constant proclamation of her own genius, in some ways is a defense mechanism, in some ways as a performance. And it's a sort of rejoinder, I guess, a sense of, I am going to take up the space and, we'll see who comes along with me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that you bring up a good point. There was a gendered aspect to the reception of her work and her ideas about art and literature that didn't necessarily apply, though I guess on some levels it did. The work of James Joyce was not received with a standing ovation that was uniform. I mean, his books were banned. He was considered crazy too. I mean, his work was rejected as well. But, Ulysses got a reception in his day that The Making of Americans never did.
Yes, that frustrated her. The two of them were often put together. In fact, Wyndham Lewis in this essay is thinking of, he lumps them together as examples of this sort of degenerate work coming out of Paris. And Joyce was quite keen to distance himself from Stein too. And in fact, it's interesting because their work is totally different. Joyce's work is saturated with history and with language and the past, whereas Stein's work is doing kind of the exact opposite, stripping associations away from language and trying to hold you in an absolute present. And she was also frustrated that friends, sort of mutual friends, kind of rallied around Joyce when Ulysses was banned. Sylvia Beach published it with Shakespeare and Company, and this was the point at which Stein had been kind of hawking the manuscript of The Making of Americans around for years to no avail. So there's a one moment where they meet at a party and have a very stilted conversation.
You mean Gertrude and James Joyce?
Yes, yeah.
Well, he was influenced by her in ways that maybe he didn't admit. Like his work, and I think this was the case with lots of writers, many of whom received more acclaim in those days than she did. But Hemingway obviously drew a lot of inspiration from her ideas around language, but maybe channeled it into more conventional forms that had a more commercial appeal.
Exactly. Yeah. She says somewhere, the followers are always accepted before the one who made the revolution. And I think she was thinking of Hemingway probably there for sure.
Yeah. I mean, another aspect of her life story that I couldn't help but take notice of as I was reading your book is how she basically had a falling out with everybody except Alice Toklas.
Yeah.
I mean, over and over again, it's like, oh, we're close, we're friends. I guess maybe she and Picasso stayed.
They had fallings out, but they came back together.
Yeah, but I mean, like, man, this woman, like her own brother, most of her family, she just cut people off. It was constant ruptures. And I would just like to hear your thoughts on that aspect of her life and character.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, friends. I mean, one thing about writing about someone so famous is that, so many people who ever brushed up against Stein, wrote memoirs about it. And she clearly made a pretty extreme impression. And often friends were bemused at why they'd been cut off by her. There was a particular kind of group of kind of younger artists who she got very close to in the 30s and then kind of cut them all off one by one on pretty spurious grounds. And, often it would be Toklas who would pick up the phone and say, don't come round again. And the reasons that were given, tended to be things that people thought, that couldn't possibly be the real reason. And I get the sense that in a way, being Gertrude Stein, the public figure was a kind of exhausting position to be in. And I think particularly after the American tour, when she'd been absolutely lionized as a celebrity, having written a book, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which was totally unlike the work that she wanted to be known for, and then having hoped that would draw attention back to the work she called her real work, but then having seen that really what people constantly wanted more of was gossip and autobiographies and, strange pronouncements and eccentric, bits of personality. I think she realized that what she really wanted actually was kind of solitude and life with Toklas. And, I think she was increasingly drawn to friends, who weren't there to see her kind of perform a role. It's interesting to compare her fallings out with everyone in literary and artistic circles in Paris with the kind of easy, close friendships she had with neighbours in the countryside and the south of France, where she and Toklas spent a lot of time, where in a way she was seen, people knew she was a writer, people accepted she was a genius, but weren't sort of, didn't have particular expectations of her.
Well, and there's no competition.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's it. I think she did also feel, very frustrated that the young men, it was usually young men who came to her very obsequious, saying how wonderful she was. I think she sometimes felt they were using her, or that, that they were going to go on and, be more successful than she was. And there's an interesting story about a friendship that went wrong when she and another poet started to translate each other's works, and then Stein wanted her name to be more prominent than the original author. and she's a bizarre character.
Well, I think one of the things that occurred to me is that there really isn't a good name or category for her. She's not an author, like we were talking about earlier. Like, you called her a philosopher of language. She's also just like an interesting thinker about creativity. I mean, I guess that's tied to being a philosopher of language. But I think that, as much as I've been kind of cowed and blown away and mystified a little bit by this like incredible self-confidence and brash self-mythologizing, and just like the relentlessness of it all feels exhausting to me. I am also, I think you also have to take your hat off to her when it comes to her artistic instincts. Like, the point that I'm trying to make is that her reputation was not entirely unfounded. It wasn't just some act of self-aggrandizement that eventually caught on, or the fact that she was wealthy and had a trust fund and was able to have this cool apartment in Paris and was able to afford all of this art. She bought the right art.
Yeah, yeah.
I
And
mean, like,
she self-supported really by having bought the art very cheap. And, very soon it had amassed so much value that she could sell it when she needed money. I mean, at one point, she decided commercial publishers weren't interested in her work. So she and Toklas decided to start their own publishing company just to publish Gertrude Stein. And they could sell a Picasso, which they'd bought for, the equivalent of $20. And,
what a dream.
yeah. So she lived well. I mean, she got things. She was in the right place at the right time.
But she also was the one who had the gumption and the clarity of mind and vision to recognize that Picasso was a genius.
Yeah.
She saw it in Matisse. And
Yeah.
so that's really interesting and like incredibly enviable. I want to say in the book, or maybe in my prep, I was reading that one of the paintings that she had bought for $30 in like 1906, later sold at auction to a Rockefeller for over $1 million, which in today's dollars would probably be like 50 million.
Yeah, well, that same painting was sold again in 2018. I think it's 115 million.
I mean, the art collection, if you were to take the art collection of Gertrude and Leo Stein, the Stein family, Michael too, if you were to take their art collection in its totality and tabulate its worth today, it's almost priceless.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Met gathered it as much as they could of it together in 2011 for an exhibition called The Steins Collect, which was at the Met and the San Francisco Art Museum, which I didn't manage to see. That was before my fascination with Stein. But it's so exciting when you go into a museum and and see one of these paintings that has had this domestic life, on the walls. And Stein and Toklas lived with these paintings, and they were part of the surroundings from which this work was generated.
Well, I want to ask you about being a biographer, which just seems like a huge task to give oneself. I'm sure you would probably agree.
Yeah.
But also to be writing a biography of a person who was so dogged in her self-mythologizing.
Yeah.
Like that, I think maybe adds a layer of difficulty, I would imagine, if you're trying to get to the truth of who a person was. You have to sort of cut through all that stuff to a degree.
Well, in a way, what I wanted to do in this book really was to, I guess, expose that, or to, to not to try and find, some sort of unified truth of Stein, because I think that's always one of the kind of artificial things about, a traditional kind of cradle to grave biography, that it's imposing a sort of narrative or, a narrative arc on a life, and lives are messy and complicated and, and full of contradictions. And Stein is absolutely full of contradictions. And also, the other falsity is that, for a biography, the story you can tell, depends on the material that's available to you and, your perspective. And, every sentence is a decision that you're making, to prioritize one friendship over another, for example, or, to what you choose to elide in the narrative, or, the questions you ask, the periods that you home in on. And I guess that's what I was trying to kind of expose in the two-part structure, that in a way the first half tells really the story of Stein's life kind of as she told it, and then the second half kind of uncovers some of the things that came out about her later, or the sort of questions people later came to ask about her, and the ways in which the picture of her changes when new information is kind of divulged, or when new perspectives kind of come to bear. And, so a life in a way is never static. And, Stein, there's the story of Stein's life while she's alive, but in a way, Stein is constantly being reformed, as new ideas come up and as people, see her in different ways. And I guess I wanted the book to sort of suggest something living about her as a figure, and, to present the biography, not as the, a story of sort of set in stone of a person from the past, but to kind of show how lives, how a story is constructed, or I guess, or, how a narrative is never set. But, the story of Toklas working for Stein's legacy after her death, is really about trying to change a narrative that that she felt the narrative of Stein's life that existed at her death, was incomplete. And, by bringing back into print works that hadn't been published, she wanted to extend the ways in which people saw Stein and give people, a much fuller sense of her body of work, in the hopes that she would come to be seen, as an important artist, not as the sort of eccentric personality which most of her obituaries kind of presented her as.
Yeah. I mean, everybody should be so lucky to have a champion like Alice Toklas, somebody who's willing to she did all the cooking, she typed up all the manuscripts. It was kind of a creative collaboration. I'm sure they had conversations about the work that were very useful to Gertrude and helped her sort of concretize her ideas. She was her fiercest protector, incredibly loyal, very jealous.
Yeah.
Like super, and I mean, it's just wild to think about. And I'm wondering, in writing about Alice, and especially these last years when she was widowed, and she was in this process of trying to kind of build a legacy and carry forward the sort of the creative dreams of Gertrude Stein, and to make sure that they would have this afterlife. If there was anything about Alice that surprised you, that you learned in the writing?
I think a lot. I mean, in a way, I didn't really know Alice while Stein was alive. I think a lot of friends felt they didn't really know her, that that she was, even though she was she was always there, and would wield the axe when she felt she'd had enough of people, or would siphon people away from Stein. She didn't give much of herself away. And there's a folder in Stein's archive after her death of people writing to Toklas, with their condolences, and there's the overwhelming kind of tone is of slight sort of carefulness, that people aren't quite sure who it is they're writing to. They're sort of realizing we always talk to Gertrude, and I guess what came through was the way that Toklas quite heroically, I think, transformed that devotion that she'd had for Stein in her lifetime into a devotion to the legacy and the work, and the kind of the way she dealt with intrusions, from biographers, who wanted to write about her, was clearly, extremely difficult and complicated for her, trying to live on herself, and she lived 20 years on her own, creating a new life outside of Stein, while also absolutely, enthralled to the past. It's a really sad story, but I think also, a very moving one. And I came to really like Toklas as well, although she's definitely a formidable character. Took no prisoners.
That's right.
And remains very shadowy in lots of ways. I mean, she, people would ask her opinions on things, and often she would tell you Stein's opinion. She wouldn't really give away her own. And that's something, I mean, I think I came to see that slipperiness actually as a deliberate sort of protective strategy. And, she became very famous for writing her cookbook in 1954. Friends had always asked her to write an autobiography, and she wrote a cookbook, which is just a brilliant, delightful book of memories of the meals that they ate. And it's, in a way, it's a justification of her own position, seen, get life with Stein as seen from the kitchen.
Well, I don't think and it's, it's notable to me that she wrote that cookbook, or wrote anything at all, well after Gertrude Stein had died. I don't know if their relationship could have survived Alice B. Toklas deciding that she too wanted to be a writer. I don't think Gertrude could tolerate anyone stealing any of her thunder.
No. And I think that's what stopped her for a long time. People kept saying, you must write about your life with Stein. And she kept saying, but Gertrude has written my autobiography. And in a way, she then, after the cookbook, she did write an autobiography called What Is Remembered, which stops at Stein's death, and kind of, it's an amazing feat, really, of writing an autobiography without giving with hardly anything of yourself away. And I think really that was Toklas's kind of last word, that she was willing to some extent to go so far, but no further.
Well, it's a super fascinating book, and it's a big project. Kudos to you for seeing it through. I have to imagine you're going to be ready for a nap at some point, like once this book tour is done. But yeah. I always end by asking my guests if they're working on anything else. Is there another book in the pipeline? Do you have your sights set on another project?
I am having a bit of a break right now talking about Stein, but I am hoping to write something about 70s New York political poets next. I think it will be a while in the works, but I'm excited to get into a slightly more recent kind of period, sort of picking up really on the end of this book and carrying on forward. Well, for everybody listening, I just want to say that Francesca and I are both misunderstood geniuses whose creative legacies will be burnished in their afterlife. Yes, Alice B. Toklas will make sure of it. Yeah, one day people are going to catch up to what we're up to. But it's been really fun to talk with you. It was a delight to read your book and to get to know and understand these figures who kind of loom large in my literary imagination and who I had a kind of Gestalt understanding of, or passing understanding of. Is that the right word? Gestalt? You know what I mean? Yeah. And now it's been clarified a little bit more and deepened. So I appreciate it. And I thank you for taking the time to talk with me, and I wish you well. Thank you so much. It was great to talk. All right, that does it for this episode. That was my conversation with Francesca Wade, author of a new biography of Gertrude Stein entitled Gertrude Stein, An Afterlife. It is available now from Scribner Books. You can find Francesca on the internet at francescawade.com. Follow her on Instagram, and I believe to a lesser extent on Twitter. And read this book if you're interested in the lost generation, if you're interested in modernism or 20th century literature, all of that stuff. Paris, lesbians, Alice B. Toklas, it's all there in this new book. Again, it's called Gertrude Stein, An Afterlife. Available from Scribner right now. Go get your copy. Don't forget to subscribe to The Otherppl Show wherever you listen. Hit that subscribe button. Follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky. Sign up for my newsletter at bradlisti.substack.com. Support this podcast over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. If you want to join the Otherppl Book Club or get a t-shirt or an Otherppl sweatshirt, you can do all of the above at the show's official website, otherppl.com. And if you want to get How to Write a Novel, the flagship course from my new company, Deep Dive, be sure to do that over at www.deepdive.audio. Last but not least, if you have a minute and you want to help me out, do me a favor, make me happy, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. Rate it, review it. It helps the show in the algorithm, and it helps it find new listeners. All right, that's it. Episode 999 is done. And next up is the 1000th author interview in the history of this program. Hard to believe, but it's about to happen. I'm not going to tell you who it is. You're just going to have to tune in. Right? I got to do a cliffhanger for 1000 coming up on Tuesday, if everything goes according to plan.